Нет войне. It means no to war. To utter those words in Russia today is an act of courage and defiance against an Orwellian regime that has outlawed the very use of the word war. Protests continued over the weekend in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and more than 50 other cities across the country. Nikita went to yesterday's demonstration near the Kremlin. He'd hardly been there 5 minutes, he told me, before police arrested him.
I arrived and somehow managed to get through the cordon that had been put up around the square, and I realised there were far more police officers than protesters. And as soon as people arrived, the police detained them and put them in the police vans.
It's difficult to say exactly how widespread these protests are. Most independent media has been shut down, and the police are skillful at making sure large crowds don't get a chance to congregate. But an independent monitoring organisation says there have been more than 13,000 arrests in the past 12 days, with a record 3,000 yesterday in Moscow alone. And the authorities seem to be trying to do everything to discourage further protests.
What we see now is increased violence by the police. For example, yesterday, some women were tortured in police stations in Moscow. I mean, really tortured. And the policeman, there is audio files of that, so there are just like real proof of that.
We've listened to two of these recordings. On one, you can hear what sounds like someone being beaten. On another, a police officer can be heard threatening violence. We haven't been able to independently verify these recordings, but they have been published by Novaya Gazeta, one of the few remaining independent media organizations whose editor won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. Last time people came out onto the streets in Russia in large numbers was 10 years ago, when Vladimir Putin returned to the presidency after a short stint as prime minister. Those protests were mercilessly quashed. Things are even tougher now. It's very unlikely that street protests are going to persuade Vladimir Putin to change course, let alone somehow remove him from the Kremlin, at least at the moment. So how might change come about in Russia? Well, it's often said that change happens from above, whether it be change of policy or some kind of palace coup. In other words, from those close to him in the Kremlin. It's sometimes helpful to think of Putin not as an individual, but as an institution, the instrument through which power is exercised in Russia and through which wealth is accumulated. Putin's power rests on a three-legged stool. One leg is the so-called siloviki, literally the strongmen, the people in the security apparatus, the FSB, the military, people like Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, the head of the armed forces. The second leg is the technocrats, the career politicians who make the system work, people like Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov or the Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin. Leg number 3 is the oligarchs, the money men. Some of them are familiar faces like Roman Abramovich or Oleg Deripaska. Mr. Deripaska today tweeted, "We need peace as soon as possible, as we have already passed the point of no return." He joined a growing group of Kremlin-connected businessmen who've had sanctions imposed on them and have expressed opposition to the war, albeit mildly. But what of the other two legs of the stool? One independent Russian journalist, currently outside of Russia, spoke to a high-level insider, a technocrat. He described the situation in, well, unbroadcastable language.
This word in Russia sounds like...
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, yeah. You translated it as clusterfuck.
Yeah.
But it's ruder than that. Putin has become increasingly inaccessible. Apart from perhaps a handful of his closest allies in the Siloviki, most in his so-called inner circle seemed to have no idea what he was planning before he launched his full-scale invasion.
They were as shocked as other people, and that's the weirdest thing. They don't feel responsible. They are just, they feel themselves like regular people regular people in Russia who cannot affect the situation. This is the moment when we are in a real black box. I mean, when we're talking about Russia.
Behind the walls of the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin has kept everyone guessing. He's a leader increasingly isolated, not just from the rest of the world, but from those around him too.